He has offered everything. He's offered everything. You're right. You know why? Because he doesn't want to around with the United States.
It's fascinating. A very audacious, extremely well planned and extremely well executed military operation, putting aside the legal issues that there will be that will inform a lot of the debate, but trying to identify exactly where President Maduro of Venezuela would be, where you could fix him for the length of time it would take to get special forces in to execute his capture, arrest, and exfiltration in a way that protects the force that's going in, is a masterstroke. It's very similar to Vladimir Putin's attempt on Kyiv, and the Americans have just shown the Russians how you carry out this sort of operation. The difficulty will be the legal basis, and we're already starting to see some of the commentary that's coming out of US senators and out of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, calling Maduro's government illegitimate and the head of a narco-terror cartel. And therefore, I think whenever we see the statement from Donald Trump later on today, we will see that being emphasized. Venezuela's military has been neutralized effectively. So, the military operation that will have gone in, initially there will have been intelligence CIA on the ground with special forces on the ground, preparing the ground. They will have been targeting those that could be immediate threats to the air package, bringing the special forces arrest teams in. And that's where we'll have seen the explosions, the air defense radars, the air defense sites, any military sites that could react being either electronically suppressed through electronic warfare or physically suppressed through explosive action going in, and then the US air package going in, picking up Maduro and out exfiltrated safely. And the Americans now saying that's the end of their military operation. That'll be the end of the overt military operation. There will still be covert operations going on the ground, and we've already seen a statement come out from the opposition party in Venezuela saying that they're ready to take over and run the government. Of course, the opposition party effectively won the 2024 presidential election, but Maduro ignored the results of that election and declared himself the winner in what's going on. And therefore, there's a period of instability. We've seen strong statements come out from Maduro's defense minister, who there were initial reports that he had been killed, but then we've seen a video of him making a statement condemning what's happening. We're seeing condemnations coming from Vladimir Putin. Haven't heard anything from Xi Jinping yet, but that could be because I've just missed it. And we're seeing a lot of the left-wing parties around the world condemning America's actions, and including left-wing parties in the UK and in Ireland condemning America's actions. The legality will, as I say, be interesting, but international law, when it comes to these sorts of things, is not black and white. It is up to interpretation, and it's interpretation by the nation that is executing the operation. And the weaker the nation that's executing the operation, the less freedom of interpretation they've got. The stronger the country, the more interpretation they've got to interpret whatever way they want to. And of course, the ultimate arbiter is the Security Council of the United Nations, of which there are 5 people that have a veto, the United States being one of them, UK, Russia, China, and France being the others. So, and the United States is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court. So the legal grey area, America can do whatever it wants around that. We're already seeing commentary coming out of the EU, in particular, Katia Kallas from the EU, who's said she's spoken with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the EU ambassador in Caracas, and said the EU is monitoring the situation closely. That's diplomatic speak for we haven't got a clue what we're doing or what's going on. And interestingly, in her statement, she said that the EU had frequently called Maduro's regime illegitimate, and had condemned it for failing to have a peaceful transition of power. And therefore, I think this is the EU doing the go on, this is all too complicated. We'll tacitly support you, but we don't want to put too much out at the minute, and behaving like ostriches. From a military planning perspective, and this is military planning and diplomatic planning, it all comes together. You don't execute an operation like this unless you've got a plan for what comes next. And that's what went wrong in Afghanistan. That's what went wrong in Iraq. and therefore there will be a clear plan for what happens next, assuming they can keep the conditions going for that plan on the ground. The Americans will have thought this through. And the timing of this particular action will be something that the Americans have been waiting for. They've been waiting for the opportunity where they can properly fix Maduro into a position to give them sufficient time to go in and get him out without him escaping and hiding in the countryside and going on the run, which would cause a huge headache for the United States and cause diplomatic issues that will go on for a long, long time. So exceptionally well executed. The diplomatic or the execution of the post military action diplomacy and the justification under international law is something that will come out in the coming hours and days. I don't think it sets a precedent. It's something that the US has done on numerous occasions beforehand. You have to remember the US invasion of Panama many years ago to overthrow the president of Panama. They've done it in Nicaragua way back in the 1980s. And we had that. The US tried to overthrow the regime in Iran, and we had the disaster in the desert where helicopters crashed into each other, and they were getting US hostages out, and that was a complete disaster of a mission. So the US has got a history of this. However, in modern times, it's setting an interesting precedent whenever this is effectively what Vladimir Putin's been using as an excuse to try and overthrow the Zelensky government. They are not the same. The Zelensky government is legitimate. Maduro's government was illegitimate. And Xi Jinping will be sitting watching this with great interest as he's got his eye very carefully focused on Taiwan. So I think it makes the world, certainly for the next week or so, a little bit more unstable. And with what's happened here, with what's now going on in Iran, with what China's been doing around Taiwan in early 2026, the world is definitely a little bit more unstable. I think it'll give Xi Jinping something to think about. What was interesting is that his delegation had just arrived in Caracas and had sat down with Maduro in the hours before this attack, and they could have been the reason why he was fixed in a place. So that will embarrass the Chinese if that comes out. It'll never come out overtly, but he will be examining that. And if the Americans had become fixed in Venezuela, so things had gone wrong and they'd been dragged into a longer operation and potentially into a war, then Xi Jinping would have gone, this gives me an opportunity now to take Taiwan because the US is focused elsewhere. The fact that the US have been in and out surgically and very quickly will give Xi Jinping something to sit back and have to think about, and possibly not necessarily embolden him, but give him more things that will concern him, showing that the Americans are still very, very capable and combat proven, something that the Chinese are not. They're not combat proven in any way. If it's a negotiated withdrawal or exfiltration, then this is something that the CIA will have set up beforehand. They will have got Maduro into a position where he can't maneuver, and they've said, look, you've got two choices: we either take you out by force, or you come willingly with us. The troops are on their way, mate, and that's what will have happened. There's a lot of talk about him being prosecuted coming out from no less people than Marco Rubio, who in a statement after this was put out, turned around and said Maduro didn't describe him as the president. In fact, he said Maduro is not the president of Venezuela. His regime is not the legitimate government. And that, from a Secretary of State, is very powerful. He said Maduro is the head of the Cartel Los Soles, a narco-terror organization that has taken possession of a country. So we can start to see where the charges are going to be framed around and possibly under some form of international statute, but it will be framed as a direct threat to the United States, and that's what we'll see coming out. And whether he will almost certainly be charged, whether that will end up in jail time or some form of negotiated settlement where he is put in permanent exile or given house arrest for the rest of his life or something. We wait and see what comes out. It'll be interesting to see Donald Trump's language at 4 p.m. UK time whenever he gives his statement on what has just happened. Venezuela's got the largest oil deposits in the world, and this is part of the thing that was frustrating Donald Trump. because that oil was being sent to back up the Chinese economy, back up the Russian economy. It was being used to pay for the corrupt and criminal groups that freely operated out of Venezuela. It wasn't being used to turn Venezuela into the the richest country in the Americas, which it should be, or certainly in South America, which it should be because of its reserves out of there, and that has frustrated Donald Trump. Of course, Donald Trump will see opportunities from a business perspective to get in and help, but the people who suffered most from the poor management of the oil resources are the people of Venezuela. They are living in abject poverty, in abject fear because of the way Maduro ran his government and ran his regime, rather than living in abject wealth and with a lot of democratic freedom. That potential is very much there. And therefore, I think that's what'll come next. The commentators that are turning on saying that Donald Trump is doing this to steal the Venezuelan oil and all the rest of it, no, that's just people who are trying to find an excuse to further attack Donald Trump. Will Donald Trump try and get US companies in and involved in it? Of course they will. But will most of the wealth go to Venezuela? Yes, it will, and it should do.